Hi, and welcome to Your Prosperity, a podcast series on financial topics including tax, wealth creation, superannuation, lending, audit, and many other things that we deal with here on a regular basis at Prosperity Advisors. As with all financial podcasts, any advice you hear in this is general in nature and not to be relied upon. Please contact us for any specific advice. Hi, and welcome to the podcast. It's the 15th of September, 2023. This podcast is going to be a bit of a part two, I guess. We did a podcast recently, part one, I'll call it, which was about doing business in Asia for Australian businesses. This is the inverse, not specifically Asian business, but anyone, small, medium-sized businesses who want to do business with Australia. So if you're an international coming to Australia to do business, this is the one for you. Part one, we talked to Inez from Des & Shira, one of our LEA affiliated accounting firms over there. So it was great to talk to Inez. If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to that one. Part two, talking to Charles Yuan, who's going to go through some of the complexities and what you need to think about if you're an overseas business coming to Australia. So Charles, thanks for joining us.
Great to join Brendan again. I'd like to share my topics, expertise on this area.
Absolutely. And I guess probably should preface, for anyone who is an overseas listener, Prosperity, we're a multidisciplinary professional firm. We do a lot with accounting and tax. We do a lot of other things as well, lending, we do audit, we do all sorts of stuff. And we work with, I guess, small to medium-sized businesses. And we're looking a little bit in this episode, as I said, of overseas business, small to medium-sized, looking to come to Australia and do business. Charles, why have we got you on? I presume you're an expert on this.
Yeah, so look, my personal focus at Prosperity, and I guess my interest area has always been on how to set up small, medium businesses, especially ones coming from overseas. What is Australia about? What do you do once you come to Australia? Any restrictions? How to structure? It's one of those areas I really like talking about.
Absolutely. And obviously, I know that is something you deal a lot with. So Charles does a lot of all that sort of stuff, but also internally, one of our tax specialists, and you've been on the podcast a couple of times, which is great. So let's jump into it, Charles. Why should foreign businesses, and not necessarily Asian, but let's go with that, because they're one of our nearer, or they're, I guess, quite close to us geographically. So a lot of Asian countries do look to do business in Australia. Why should they consider coming to Australia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Australia, we're a little nation down the South Pacific, all by ourselves, New Zealand next to us. But surprisingly, despite all that, Australia is one of the leading economies in the world. The statistics is by GDP, we're 13th, and by GDP per capita, we're ranked 10th in the world. So that's way up there with, any other developed countries that you can think of.
Yeah, okay. You've done some research there, Charles. I like this.
Yeah. And then, thinking about Australia, like, why would foreign businesses come to Australia? Aside from being one of the leading economies in the world, we do have a very strong mature market, strong political system, very strong business law, and generally our Australian workforce is highly skilled. So there's a lot in the making of a strong developed economy in Australia, which is, I guess, one of the key attractions. And specifically for Asian businesses, we're pretty much right next to Asia. So it just makes sense that if you need any of those factors, Australia is the obvious choice.
Yeah, and I think Inez said in hers, which I was a bit surprised at, she said 12 of our 15 biggest trading partners are in Asia, which is, it makes sense geographically. So
yeah,
I was a bit surprised
definitely.
at that. I haven't fact checked that one, but I assume that's right. But I was just a bit surprised to hear that. But that's it does make sense geographically.
Exactly, it does make sense. Yeah, and
we're obviously a bit, cost of labour is probably a lot higher in Australia, but we're absolutely a trading partner with a lot of Asian countries. So yeah, really good spot to do business. So what's the incentives for them, Charles? Is there tax incentives? What's the benefit? Why should they be doing business here?
Yeah. I mean, aside from all those strong market factors, from a tax perspective, because that's what I specialize in, there's actually a lot of benefits for businesses. Now, Australia is probably not the innovation or financial hub that you would normally think of, and honestly, it's not. But yeah, there's still a lot on offer for businesses. So
It wants to be, though. We want to be.
we want to be. It's I guess part of it is political, but yeah, the usual innovation hubs like the US, we just can't compete with that. We don't have the capital in Australia, but we do have a very strong market, very strong workforce, highly skilled. So it and the government is always open to foreign businesses. So
And I guess we push a few tax
mm,
incentives towards that,
mm.
those things, so E6, R&Ds, all that sort of stuff. We push a bit there. Maybe, what are those couple of incentives we can offer?
Yeah. So thinking about innovation, one of the biggest thing that the Australian government offers and has been for a long time is what's called the research and development tax incentive, or R&D tax incentive. And what that gives is potentially up to 43.5% tax refund on expenditure undertaken by a business for R&D activities. So
Mm-hmm.
think if you spend, say, $1 million, you can potentially get back 435,000, like almost half of what you spend can get back as a tax refund. That's a great incentive for
Absolutely.
businesses, startups. When you're starting up a business or you're researching things, there's a lot of capital and funds required. That just helps to stretch it much further and drive the innovation.
Yeah,
And
and with all of those sort of things, it's very important to get the detail right. It's not as though you just set up and get that. You've got
yeah,
to make sure that's set up, applied for, the right structure, the right, it has to
exactly.
be a company, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot
That's
of
right.
detail that goes in the background, but there
Mm.
is that opportunity. And if someone could speak to an expert like yourself on that, it does make that fairly appealing.
Absolutely. And don't forget, aside from the R&D tax incentive, which is a federal program because it's part of federal income tax, there's
Yeah.
also different state level incentives. There's all types of grants for innovation in specific sectors. So it's not just about tax, but there's a lot of government support out there for people who wants to go into specific fields that the government wants to encourage.
And ESIC as well, obviously, is another one there that's
Correct.
that's
Yeah,
available.
ESIC, that's early stage investor companies. It's an excellent tool for attracting investors into a startup business. And the biggest thing you get out of that is, depending on the level of investment, potentially your shares is capital gains tax free if it's sold.
Depending on the timing of it and the
Yeah,
setup and everything else.
exactly.
Yeah.
Depending on timing, that. But for early investors, if you want to invest in a startup, that's an excellent benefit.
So tax incentives, grants, research and development stuff. There's lots of those side. What other sides are there? What other key considerations would you look at if you're coming to Australia? So it's not a light decision you'd make, and obviously we're not going to get into a lot of detail in this podcast.
Mm,
It's just a bit of a shout out to what you can and can't do out there.
yeah.
But what's some of the other considerations you'd consider when coming to Australia? And off the top of my head, I guess one of the things I'd be considering is a very strong political decision making. I guess our politics and our government, it changes between Liberal and
Mm,
Labor, but they're pretty consistent in their approach. And it's not as though a change that happens in Australia 1 year changes completely 2 years later. We're a very stable economy in
yeah.
that regard. I presume that's one of the big ones.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big ones. Political stability is probably one of the biggest factors that businesses look for, because as you say, you don't want coming based on a particular position and then government changes 180 degrees a couple of years later and throwing
Yeah.
everything, into the air. So, you know, Australia, both sides of the government, political spectrum, they're always encouraging businesses in
Yep.
different ways, but encouraging businesses to thrive. There's a lot of benefits given out via businesses.
Yep.
And generally Australia is a business friendly country. So what you would consider is what restrictions are there to the type of business you want to do. So one of the key things to consider is, is there any type of regulation on your industry? Now, typical ones you will think of, banking, financial services, defense, medical. That's kind of expected. You want to tighten those areas for societal and national security reasons.
Yep.
But other areas that some businesses need to think of as well is there's when you acquire significant Australian assets, you do need to get what's called approval from the Foreign Investment Review Board, or FIRB. So when you think of acquiring large parcels of agricultural land or large interest in an Australian business that has national interest concerns, that's something to think of as well. So it's not just come in with a lot of money and buy something. There's process to go through, but aside from that, as long as you factor that in, it's all it's part of the process.
And foreigners can still buy land, is my understanding, in Australia. Obviously, significant portions of land going through FIRB, but there's other ways, and I guess you don't have to buy. We're not talking about someone buying half of Northern Territory here. We're talking about smaller businesses coming to invest and looking to get involved. If you're there's little rules around if you're going to trade here, if you've got a company here, you do need to have an Australian resident director and those sort of things. So there's a couple of those hoops to jump through as well. Any other ones there, I guess, of major note? Or I know it's a short podcast. I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty detail of everything, but I guess it's Foreign Investment Board, who can be a director of companies. Do we also look, I guess, structures? So speaking of companies, if you're a foreign investor looking to come into Australia to operate, what structures do you look at? Should you be structured in Australia? Can you use your own entity that you might have established overseas? How does that play?
Thinking about structures, and that's again one of the key considerations that a business will have to make, because the ways businesses are structured in Australia could be quite different to overseas. A company limited by shares is quite common, and it's a common feature of many other countries in the world. So you may think automatically, I just set up a company in Australia, but that's not always the best solution in Australia, because we do have other structures such as trusts, partnerships.
We love a trust in Australia.
And that's one of the things that if you're a private investor coming to Australia, there's no reason why you have to stick to the company structure. A trust structure in Australia could work just as well for you. Trust is, as you and I know, Brendan, very popular. Pretty much every client in Australia has one. So
a big generalization, but there is a lot more flexibility depending on the type of investment you're doing and what it is you're engaging here. But there's obviously absolutely agree. Not always just a company's the right option. There's definitely other things to consider.
That's right. Now, having said that, you still, if you're a foreign corporation that's investing in Australia, you're setting up a subsidiary or a branch, chances are you're probably still going to go down the company route, because that will be the most compatible with your countries. Because I know in a lot of Asian countries, trust wouldn't be recognized, or there's difficulty to see who is the ultimate beneficiary of a trust. In other Asian countries, there may be mandatory audit requirements. So setting up a company in Australia, there's different reporting requirements. So
particularly if it's a subsidiary of the other, of your Asian business, I guess.
Yeah. So that's a lot of cases that I've dealt with in my career, and I have quite a bit of experience in that. I guess prosperity can definitely help in that kind of areas, but it's all things you need to consider.
What about CFCs? Do you get involved with that a bit as well? I guess in the foreign controlled companies, that's obviously something to consider as well.
That's right. Yeah, it's with CFC, it sort of links to what is a corporate residency. So if you set up an entity in Australia, who controls it? Where's the income taxed? Who has taxing jurisdiction? So and then it links to double tax treaties, which Australia actually has double tax treaty with a lot of countries, not all, but a lot of countries. So
most Asian countries,
yeah,
apart from the obvious ones, would. I think I joked with Inez earlier that obviously we don't. I don't think we have one with North Korea, or I assume not, but
no,
we're probably not doing much trading there anyway.
yeah,
But most other Asian countries we've got some sort of dual tax agreement with, and I guess the key to those is if you're, I'm really simplifying this. There's a lot more to it, but if you're a foreign entity and you're doing business in Australia, Australia has the right to tax that income typically first, and then you'd likely get a credit for that in your origin country, wherever the rest of your business is run from. That you'd likely get a credit for that tax over there. And the inverse for an Australian, if you're doing business in one of the Asian countries or any country, if there's a dual tax agreement in place, the sourcing country would get, normally, very generalized here, they're all different, but generally the sourcing country would have first right to tax, and then you get a credit in Australia for it. So yeah, they work a bit hand in hand, and as you said, we've got agreements with most countries.
That's right. Yeah, so generally double taxation is not something of concern. So Australia is part of the good political and business system. It's that's all taken care of. We just need to decide how to set it up in Australia, meet all regulation requirements, and off you go.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a bit to it. It's not. I'm sure no one's going to listen to this podcast and then just go and start buying land in Australia. Obviously, the key is talk to people and understand what are your options and how you should do it, because getting it right from the start is very important. But
absolutely,
Australia is a trading entity or an entity that deals a fair bit with Asia. I think it's important to make sure we get that right. And as I said, the inverse, if you're an Australian business looking to do business with Asian countries, had the podcast with Inez earlier, so it was really good to get those insights. And if you're a foreign resident looking to come into Australia, or in fact you want any specific tax advice, Charles is your man for those sort of things. So Charles, appreciate it. I know it's a very high level overview. It's really hard to go into the sort of detail because every agreement is going to be different with those dual tax agreements with other countries. But I guess the main takeaways for me are we've got tax incentives, we've got grants, structuring you can get right. We've got a pretty stable geopolitical environment that encourages trade with Australia. So hopefully anyone out there looking to come in, there is opportunity in Australia, and it's a great place to invest. And as you and I know, a great place to live, but a great place to invest and to do business with. So Charles, if people want to get in contact with you, chat more about it, reach out, what's the best way?
Yeah, so just visit our website, prosperity.com.au. You can email me direct on cyuan@prosperity.com.au. Happy to take all inquiries, no matter which part of the world you are in. Biggest takeaway, get advice early. Don't jump into it without getting advice.
Yeah, absolutely. No, appreciate it, Charles. As always, thank you very much for jumping on the podcast. Valuable insights there. So, probably a bit of a niche market, I guess, and not our regular listeners, but the overseas listeners, that might be something you're keen on. So, Charles, thanks for joining us. And for everyone out there listening, hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to know more about Prosperity, go to prosperity.com.au, listen to the previous podcasts, and chat to you soon. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. Hopefully you liked it, and if so, please give us a few stars, like and share. And if you'd like to follow the series, please subscribe and pass any information on to your friends as well if you think they might like it. For more information about who we are, head to prosperity.com.au and follow the links.